I am incredibly thrilled to be able to be here with you today. And I'm going to be kind of a little informal with my remarks. I might share a poem with you. And I want to kind of talk about work that I've done related to diversity in our field, which I really equate with the relevance of our field, both, if you will, kind of from outside the traditional large institutions in terms of the Sphinx perspective, and then also from the perspective now where I come from, leading a very large and long-standing institution. But I figure as we delve into this, one of the best ways to start is just with a little bit of music. So young Danielle, who won the Sphinx competition, went on to become a tenure-track faculty member at the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance. They invited her to come and join Michigan before they invited me to come and join Michigan, and has just been tremendous there and has founded her own summer program, which is now one of the leading music summer programs, Center Stage Strings, in the country. And one of my favorite quotes is from Ashley Montagu, one of the great humanists who wrote The Elephant Man, The Natural Superiority of Women. And he said, "The deepest defeat suffered by human beings is constituted by the difference between what one was capable of becoming and what one has in fact become." And I think when Danielle was young, or any of the Sphinx participants were young, what people might have thought they were capable of becoming when they finally reached the stage of Carnegie Hall and the other venues around our country that they've been featured in. And in my role at Michigan, I think about what and how we educate, train, and prepare our students. Those are the most important factors in determining what they become. And I'm going to talk a little more just about how we're trying to effectuate that at Michigan. But anytime I've talked with people, and sometimes people say, "Oh, you're a workaholic, or you work a lot," I don't feel like I work at all. And part of that is because my work life and my personal life blend. My work is my life, and it's not that I don't have a family, but they are intertwined. And so for me to talk about the work that I do, it's really impossible to do that without talking about my personal life, because it fuels everything that I do. So I figured I might as well just start at the very beginning. I was born on, of all days, September 11th, 1970, in upstate New York, in Monticello, New York, and I was immediately given up for adoption. I was adopted by a white Jewish couple who were from Chicago, who were neuroscientists, come and they were at Rockefeller, and who already had, which is atypical for a couple who are adopting, a biological son. So they already had a birth son, my older brother, who is now a cellular biologist and biogeneticist at Columbia. So I was literally the black sheep of the family. So I was an artist, I was spontaneous, I was, a little bit off kilter, and they were very thoughtful, measured, methodical. My brother won what was at the time the Westinghouse Science Fair, in high school. And so fast forward 31 years, I was reunited with my birth parents. My birth father, who's Black Jehovah's Witness, my birth mother, who's white Irish Catholic. And even though, because it was 1970 and interracial marriage was still illegal in several states, my mother's parents put her in an unwed mother's home and forced her to give me up for adoption. Despite that, several years later, they got back together and had another child, my full sister, who they did raise and who I was able to convince to come to the University of Michigan. And so we are incredibly close. We text all of the time, and she keeps me grounded in millennials. So And she now practices law and works for legal aid in Manhattan because she wanted to really try and do many of the things in the legal field that I've been trying to do in the performing arts field. So in the end, basically, I'm a black, white, Jewish, Irish, Catholic, Jehovah's Witness who plays the violin, used to have a big afro growing up. So you can see why this is my life's work, everything that I do in the performing arts. And one of the things, as I was going through, I figured I would just share with you, because in this kind of combination of my life, where it is the performing arts, but I am in some ways fueled by evidentiary data and logic that I'm sure comes from my parents and my brother, I think it's critically important that we quantify the importance of the work that we do. And as I was actually thinking about myself in these circumstances, and I've often felt very alone and didn't really have a peer group, especially when I was young, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. I felt like, well, maybe I should actually quantify my particular status in terms of adoption and identity. So I did. So I looked at all of the adoption odds and statistics in America, and it was kind of interesting because when we actually look at black children adopted into white homes, what we find is that in the entire history of America, prior to 1975, there were only 12,000 total black children adopted into white homes. And the interesting thing, it's a little bit faded here, but if you can see, right at the year 1970, what otherwise is usually only 1% of adoptions, which are these interracial adoptions of black children into white homes, there was one year in the entire history of our country where it more than doubled, and that was the year that I was born. So the odds that I would have actually had this life trajectory that I had were remarkably, remarkably small. So I took the actual number, and the total blacks, again, adopted into white homes since my birth, because I wanted to figure out how many others like me are there out there. And there were actually 40,000 since 1970. So I was like, okay, that's good. It is less than 1% of all adoptions, but there's a fair number of people out there. However, I had a unique circumstance because most children are not adopted into what's called a blended household, which means that there's already a birth child. And the unfortunate reality, and I've brought this through my artistry, and especially through my violin playing when I was young, was that I was never the priority in either of my parents' households. And what I mean by that is that the relationship my adoptive parents had with my adoptive brother is and has been and continues to be different than mine is. And while you don't like to kind of quantify these things, in my particular case, it was lesser. I had a rough childhood, rebellion, and all of that, and for a number of years was estranged from my parents, and that just wouldn't have been possible in terms of my brother's relationship with them. And this is the kind of stuff that music and the performing arts are made to communicate to others. So it was interesting that I was adopted into what's called a blended household. It's about 25% of adoptions are adoptions into blended households, so that brought us down to about 10,000. Now, I was surprised to learn that very few adoptees actually search for their birth parents. And the number actually happens to be about 4%. So that left me with about 400 who were actually searching and ultimately reunified with their birth parents, which is only 1%, believe it or not, which left me with 4. However, the additional thing that was kind of interesting is that I was reunified into a blended household. In other words, the chances that you're actually reunified to parents, birth parents, who not only are together, but actually had another child that they raised is, again, only about 25%, which didn't really help my cause, so I ended up writing a book and self-commiserated with myself. But I think it is important to quantify and to measure, because what it did do is it did empower me to understand that certain things that I was experiencing, I didn't necessarily have a direct peer group, and how could I potentially express that through my music and through other artistry. So to get back to kind of my upbringing, my adoptive mother was an amateur violinist. And so when I was 5, I was completely enamored with it, and I was very, very, very lucky to be able to have fantastic teaching growing up. Vladimir Grafman is one of the great Russian teachers, brought the Russian school of teaching over to the United States, was my first teacher. And my father, in addition to being a neuroscientist, was an amateur photographer, so there are some of these great photos from when I was a kid. And grew up in New York, went to the 92nd Street Y, and was able to, at a very young age, begin to play chamber music. And so I interacted more with others through music than I did socially. That was my social interactions that I had. And so then it was very interesting because at the age of 10, we moved from New York to Hershey, Pennsylvania, which at the time had one black family in my school district in Hershey and me. And so that was very interesting, but it also led me to be further ostracized, but it did enable me to be able to become even more deeply connected with my violin, which is the greatest constant in my life, is my violin. And so I had some wonderful experiences going down on Saturdays to Peabody Prep in Baltimore. And ultimately, for my junior and senior year of high school, I went to the Interlochen Arts Academy, which was kind of my introduction to the state of Michigan. And the Interlochen Arts Academy saved my life. And when I say that, I do literally mean that. The University of Michigan helped build my life, but at the time, and I really wasn't at home since I was 14 years old, it was kind of juvie or this unbelievable, amazing life in the performing arts. It really is incredible how sometimes, and what I see in a lot of the young people that I've worked with is similar moments in life that can completely change the entire trajectory of your life. And I believe the performing arts, the work that all of us do every day, can have that type of profound effect, not just on individuals and young individuals, but on our society. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So I thought I would share just a brief poem, because around this time in my life, unfortunately, whenever I heard from other people, it really wasn't about, oh, Aaron, this is so great, you're a violinist. It was often, oh, you're not really black, are you? Because black people with afros don't play the violin. So feedback I got, not just from peers, but from adults, almost sought to separate me from my own cultural identity that I was trying to figure out because of my entrenchment with the violin. And so I have a book of poetry, and the title poem from that I just wanted to share with you, which is entitled, "They Said I Wasn't Really Black." Born from white and brown young skins, I was so different from the pack. Adopted by Caucasians at just 2 weeks of age, they couldn't have known about the other people. They said I wasn't really black. A violinist I was destined for early on, I showed them the knack. It was Mozart for me and Beethoven too. I never got to memorize Jackson 5 lyrics, so they said I wasn't really black. School bells and cafeteria food, I sat there with my brown lunch sack. There was no confrontation between watermelon and black-eyed peas. They said I wasn't really black. I'd stroll into the rehearsal room wishing I was the Daddy Mac. I didn't even go to the games, let alone sport the jersey. Hell, I wasn't even in the band, and I wonder why they said I wasn't really black. I didn't talk the talk and couldn't walk the walk. Familial precedent I did lack. At first it seemed correct by design. It took me years till I was uncomfortable when they said I wasn't really black. There were those who made me feel different and a few who I thought had my back. I could have taken all the racial slurs if only it wasn't my friends around when they said I wasn't really black. All I sought was acceptance, any click shell I could not crack. They feared the anomaly. Too bad for me that I got good grades, couldn't play spades because they said I wasn't really black. And then it settled down on me, waiting unease upon my back. Like the line and rhyme of these words I write, I had only just begun to fight when they said I wasn't really black. The first African queen I was to know drew me in like the sweet lilac. She shut those doors, supposedly wanted more, but I knew the reason behind because they said I wasn't really black. For a time I had an afro. It should have got me on the track. Foolish me to think they'd see what I wanted to be. Why did they all have to agree? My skin was just a racial gee. Hopelessly, eventually, they said I wasn't really black. I'm glad I found out that they were wrong. I ain't born in Uncle Tom's shack. I guess they wish the color was not what it is, but what they wanted it to be when they said I wasn't really black. I have come to terms with what I cannot fight. I yearn no longer to attack. The title I sought without emerged from within. There was serenity and complacency while impervious to chagrin when they said I wasn't really black. Every moment I burst with pride. I toss a memory in my sack. Their jibes ebb like the tide as I open the floodgates wide. It was quite a ride. Over now, save the rare aside. I wish I wouldn't have cried. I kind of hope they lied when they said I wasn't really black. So continuing on, I found myself at the University of Michigan with my teacher, Steve Ships. I went into a lesson one day, and he said, do you want to play some music by black composers? And I was actually a little put off. And I was like, are you patronizing me? I didn't know there were any black composers. And so I thought, does he mean jazz or something like this, which is also an absurd statement to make. And he starts laughing, and he starts pulling these volumes of works off of shelves. Joseph Boulon St. George, an Afro-French contemporary of Mozart's. William Grant Still, one of the most prolific American composers of any background. And so this led to me beginning to focus on works by composers of color in my undergraduate and graduate recitals. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that developed. Around the same time too, and some of these pictures might be a little hard, but I was doing my recitals, and because of a lot of the circumstances I had been in, I was trying to draw the most out of my experience at the University of Michigan. So I was doing a lot of recitals. I was doing more than what is required. One of my favorite quotes, Arthur Johnson, one of our great civil rights leaders in Detroit, and I had asked him before he passed, I said, what is the single most important thing in your life that has enabled you to live this incredible life that you have led? And he said, doing more than what is required. And so what I began to do was a lot of this interdisciplinary work. So on the top you see I do electric violin stuff. I worked with dancers and choreographers. So for my just regular recitals, instead of getting up and playing Beethoven, Brahms, and Mozart, I was already beginning to explore and using imagery of sculptures and artwork that various musical pieces were based on. And so in the end, Michigan really empowered me to be able to be relevant to my art form and to my community. And that was a key thing and something that I'm going to talk about as we think about how do we develop our artists. So around the same time that I was in my lesson and exposed to this incredible music, I would go to an orchestra concert and barely see anyone of color, not just on stage, but more importantly to me, in the audience. Classical music had transformed my life. So I was like, how are there not other people from communities that I share cultural heritage and identity with having their lives transformed as well? And so I began to delve into it, and what came out with is an initial idea of what if there was a competition for musicians like me? And we could come together, be required to play music by composers of color, which would bring light to this music, and then gain scholarships so that we could go out and build these careers. And if we went out, then we would be out there, it would diversify the field, and the world would be a better place. And that was the initiation, while I was still an undergraduate student of, at the time, the Sphinx competition that then became the Sphinx Organization. And so as soon as I did that, that scientific part of my upbringing said, well, quantify. And what have people done? You're not the first person to think about inclusion and diversity in the arts. So I began to look at these, and so what I wanted to do is to paint this picture of what it is now in the field so that we understand exactly where we're at, because that gives us a sense of what are the priorities, resources, and action steps we need to take to actually bring about a difference. Orchestras is a great way to give a kind of barometer for the entire field. The numbers shift a little bit in dance and theater, but they are very similar. So if we look at regular American orchestras and we look at the variety, we look basically a little under 2% for blacks and a little over 2% for Latinos in terms of regular positions. No big surprise, there is a dramatic underrepresentation. To give you a sense, when Sphinx was founded, they were both less than 1%. So we've been able to more than double the percentages, but that means we're here. And for every major orchestra in America that increased its African American members, either the orchestra was a partner of Sphinx or the person who joined was an alum of a Sphinx program, including the Sphinx Symphony. Every single instance. So even if you think about an organization, started by an undergraduate student, you can make a direct impact in our field. So these are dramatic, but it's important to understand that there is a context in the overall population. And it's important to understand that when I began thinking about Sphinx, I was not thinking about having an affirmative action organization. It wasn't my focus to provide support for a particular cultural group. My goal was to diversify the performing arts, was to diversify initially classical music, because it was this field that I loved, and I knew directly how limiting it was and how the field, my art form, was suffering because of this lack of inclusion, the lack of additional voices being brought to the art form that I love. And so the goal of Sphinx is to address the underrepresentation. So it's important to understand what representation is in the overall field. We obviously have dramatic underrepresentation, and these are growing, of course, demographically by leaps and bounds. And then sometimes people would say, well, for the Sphinx competition, why do you not include Asian Americans? And that is because since our goal is underrepresentation and Asian Americans are overrepresented in the field, that is why for now, Sphinx focuses. But if that was to change, Sphinx's mission would change, because Sphinx's goal is an inclusive performing arts field. Whatever groups or segments of our society are underrepresented. So to give you another quick stat, I'll just roll through a few of these. As no big surprise, when we look at our conductors, again, about 2% Black, 2% Latino. When we look at executive directors, so the CEOs of our orchestras, less than half of 1% are Black. Less than 1% are Latino. So again, we're not talking about minimal numbers here. We're talking about dramatic underrepresentation. When we look at artistic administrators across America's 1,200 orchestras, statistically 0% are Black or Latino. Even if we look at education community relations, which, to be frank, this is where a lot of orchestras place and hire and identify a person of color, in large part because it is the person within the orchestra charged with the connection with the community. Almost all of those communities for America's major orchestras are majority minority. Even in this area, it is still only 3% for Blacks and 2% for Latinos. So the data that should fuel the percentage, the amount of resources we apply towards these issues, the staffing, the percentage of our budgets, and the action steps we have to take if we are actually going to have an impact. And finally, in this area, I just wanted to share with you programming. No big surprise, top 10 composers that our orchestras perform, 0% are Black or Latinos, but that's a little bit skewed because the reality is we perform very few North American composers. So I felt like it would be more fair, let's only pull out the North American composers that our orchestras perform. Even if we only take that subset, it is still 0%. So after Sphinx will celebrate its 20th year this next year, if Sphinx had as its programming milestone to have 1% of the works our orchestras perform be by any composer of color, we have yet to reach that milestone. Any composer of color. So, despite that there is much work to be done, Sphinx has been able to do a fair amount of work and has the international convening, Sphinx Con, do major awards each year, including in DC for the Sphinx Medals of Excellence, reached over 100,000 students in 200 schools, 2 summer programs, obviously the national competition, the touring Sphinx Virtuosi, and the Sphinx Symphony. So in the end, Sphinx has really had the opportunity through the contributions and leadership of a host of people, including the field itself, to be able to be the most relevant national arts organization in terms of its specific mission. And so it was within the context of that a year ago that the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance invited me to come and be part of the school. And it was interesting because Sphinx had been my life's work and I wasn't really looking to leave. But I knew that the organization could continue without me and has continued to do incredible things. I keep feeling like they're making me look bad over this past year. And it's because of a testament to the amazing team. But when I was joining Michigan, I was thinking, okay, so this is much different, right? And that was the big question. Okay, we're bringing someone who certainly doesn't have the typical academic background to become dean of one of the top performing arts schools in the country. And not only that, but I am a firm believer in don't fix what ain't broke. And there's a whole lot, of course, about SMTD, as our initials go, not the best initials, but they are ours. How do I make sure that I bring about change in a completely different setting than Sphinx, not an entrepreneurial setting, without breaking or fixing what really isn't broken? So I took a look, again, going to the stats, and I won't go through all of these, but it's, it's a great school, about 180 faculty, 90 staff. We have a great student-faculty ratio. There's some wonderful accomplishments. We have amazing alums. The musical theater is on my mind because of our wonderful singers that we had here. One of the leading musical theater programs in the country. So one of the things is one of my favorite quotes came to mind, which is Susan Scott. If you aren't familiar with her, I encourage you to. She founded the Fierce System. She has a great TED Talk. And she said, our work, our relationships, and our lives succeed or fail one conversation at a time. And while no single conversation is guaranteed to change the trajectory of your life, any single conversation can. So speak and listen as if this is the most important conversation you will ever have with this person, because it could be. And so as I began to do my listening tour, and every conversation that I had with people at the school and externally about the school, I was approaching with this frame of mind. And her words are very powerful for me. I try to live my life this way, not just professionally, but personally as well. I think we all have moments in our lives where our trajectory literally changed because of one conversation, personal or professional, that we just didn't realize at the time. And if we might have approached it this way for the negative ones, we could have avoided them. And for the positive ones, we could have even empowered them even more. So what I came away with was that we had this amazing institution. We had some amazing things happening in musical theater. We had some amazing things happening in our strings. We had amazing things happening in all of the 15 different departments that comprise our school. But what unifies us? What drives us forward? What train are we on? And what matters about that and binds all of us in the same way that our field binds, I believe, our society? And so I felt like it was critically important to have a vision for the school. And so I had these very meaningful conversations, and from those developed our vision. And what I would say too is, because a lot of us may have done vision and mission work and so on and so forth, and it takes months and months, and very often it sits in a drawer, so on and so forth. And the school had a great mission. It has a great mission. I didn't change it. But if you walk around the school and you ask any of our 1,100 students, or you ask the 180 faculty, no one is going to give you exactly the same mission, because no one can repeat something that is long. It's just not human nature. We just don't do it. So to me, the importance of a vision is something that is simple, straightforward, and that binds all of us. And so our vision at SMTD is to be the most relevant school of the performing arts in the world. That's it. That's it. And if you go to anyone at Michigan and you ask them, what is the vision? They will be able to tell you. One of the things that just filled me was I was so just happy that what my intention was actually bore out. I was down on campus. We did this great project, by the way, if you haven't heard. It's called The 7 Last Words of the Unarmed. Our men's glee club did this and commissioned a composer who wrote this work for the glee club that is only comprised of the last words spoken by the 7 African-American men who were shot, who were unarmed, who were killed. And it's incredibly powerful, it's evocative, and actually we did a short documentary on it that was premiered at the school this past year, and Amadou Diallo's mother saw that this work was going on just online and reached out, and she came. And it was amazing. We had a little panel after the airing of the documentary, and she sat there and she said, you know, there were protests and demonstrations after, and she said, this work will have more of an impact than the protests and the demonstrations. This work is about my son's legacy and what his life was actually about, and not the media kind of circus that was created around it. And that's because his last words in a phone call to her in Africa was, Mom, I'm going to college. His life was about education. And so in the piece, in the artistic work, that comes through incredibly clearly, as it does for the other 6. And that's, again, the power of what we do every day and how it can impact our society and impact people who are having profound experiences in our society. So I was there, and I went down to Central Campus, and I was doing a shooting. They were just interviewing me for this documentary, and they said, oh, we had several students in here earlier today, and they all separately mentioned about how the school is going to be the most relevant school of the performing arts, our students. So when your vision pervades every aspect of your institution, that is when it's a vision, not when it's greatly crafted and articulated and sits in a drawer and people feel really good, a working group feels really good about having spent 6 months to develop it. I hate to tell you, it's terrible. You know, you put in all this work, but it just doesn't matter in the end if it isn't inculcated into the DNA. One of my favorite quotes, Lyndon Johnson, on signing into existence the NEA, he says, art is a nation's most precious heritage, for it is in our works of art that we reveal to ourselves and to others the inner vision which guides us as a nation. And where there is no vision, the people perish. And I do believe an institution where there is no vision, its impact can perish. So what do we mean when we say relevance? So we actually literally mean the dictionary definition: to have a significant, demonstrable bearing on the matter at hand. So the way that our vision really plays out at Michigan is twofold. We want to educate and train our students to be relevant to their fields of study, so that by the time they graduate, they are relevant. And that could mean something totally different to a musical theater student than it does to our music education student. And secondarily, that we are empowering our faculty and our students to have the fields of study we are training them in be relevant to society. We can have a student be incredibly relevant in a particular field, but if that field has no relevance in society, is that the work that we are focused on doing? And we don't believe so. So we believe we have an obligation to do the work to make sure the fields of study that we are immersed in, that we know are incredibly valuable, are relevant to our society. And if we do this work, we'll have incredibly happy grads, and they'll be very successful and eventually give the school a whole bunch of money, and we'll be able to do more things. So how do we do this work? That, I think, is also very important. And are there things, pillars, that bind us in terms of how we achieve relevance? And in that matter, are there things that we think it would be impossible to be the most relevant school of the performing arts without? And so we have, and you'll see the reference, right, to the Lyndon Johnson inner vision, inner pillars. So, and I love little acronyms. So our inner pillars are innovation, inclusion, excellence, and resources. And I wanted to talk just a little bit about these to share with you kind of what they mean to us. But again, to be the most relevant school of the performing arts, and we build that on our inner pillars: innovation, inclusion, excellence, and resources. So innovation, right? The tech sector likes to talk about disruptive. You have to be disruptive. That's kind of the core of it. And I shared that with all of our faculty and with the school, and most importantly with my boss, the provost, initially, that I was being brought in to be innovative, to be creative, to bring about a trajectory and an evolution for our school that was a bit atypical if we look at the school's history. And so I shared, by definition, if it's not disruptive, it's probably not innovative. So there's going to be some disruption. And I wanted to prepare people as much as possible because I didn't want unprepared disruption, but I did want to make sure that that was there and to empower our faculty and students to be disruptive. Innovation also, I believe it's a matter of timing. I mean, in our field, there's, Beethoven using various complex, compositional methods and so on and so forth. Now, of course, he's wouldn't be considered innovative. So at any point in time, there are things that are innovative. Innovation is just whether you are the first to do it. And so one of the things that I'm always asking our faculty, our staff, and our students is, do you want to hear about something being done somewhere else and then copy it? Or do you want to try something and be the one that other people copy? And if you do that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, it means that you're going to have to accept failure. So innovation, also just entrepreneurship. So as part of this, we developed this past year what's called our Excel program. So this is excellence in entrepreneurship, career empowerment, and leadership. Yes, it doesn't exactly meet the acronym. We played with it a little bit because we just really love Excel, right? Now we have Accelerator Grants. We have a little Excel center. But this was important because we needed some type of focal point at the school for all faculty, all students, all staff to relate to that's centered around career development. This connection of being relevant at the school to then being, how will I be relevant when I leave the school? Three main components. One is actual coursework and entrepreneurship. The second is workshops. We bring in practicing entrepreneurs so that our students aren't just reading about theory of entrepreneurship. They are talking to those who are currently doing it out in the field, experiencing them, gaining them as mentors and as role models. And third, arguably most important, is our Accelerator Grants. We now give direct grants to students so that we have, through the courses, taught them how to be entrepreneurs. We have empowered them with role models and mentors who are actual practicing entrepreneurs who can help them avoid as many pitfalls as possible. But then we don't stop there. We actually empower them by giving them the money to do their projects. And if things go hopefully as well as we hope with our resource development, which I'm also going to talk about in a second, come next fall, we will be able to grant more direct dollars to students for entrepreneurial arts endeavors than any other performing arts school in the country. That's how important we feel this is. And obviously, I'm driven by it because I know what the university did in terms of helping me to found Sphinx. And without the school and without those resources, which at the time I had to pull, they didn't just exist in a program. So I was like, how can we try and replicate and duplicate this so that we can have every year 10 to 20 Sphinx organizations, if you will, being developed out of our school. And finally, chamber music, because I think chamber music is one of these incredible, innovative platforms that we have in our field that is dynamically changing. The vast majority of new members of Chamber Music America over the past 5 years are not traditional string quartets, wind ensembles. They are the hybrids. And so we've been very deeply invested in chamber music. We launched M-Prize, which is now the largest chamber music competition in the world, a $100,000 grand prize. But most importantly, it has not just a strings division and a winds division, it has what's called the open division, which has all different kinds of anything that's 3 to 8 individuals per part, making incredible music in a host of different ways. So very exciting, and again, that gets to innovation. Brene Brown, one of the great organizational kind of theorists, says there is no innovation and creativity without failure, period. So I have been talking to everyone repeatedly about embracing failure, and I start with myself. I say, just so that you know, there are some of these things that we're starting, they are going to fail. They are just going to fail. I'm prepared for it. I'm ready for it. I prepped the provost for it. And so I want to make sure you feel free to be able to fail. Thoughtful, measured, get your data, do your homework failure, but yet try. Don't avoid the actual attempt because of your fear of failure. So innovation, critically important. Inclusion, also critically important, and it's important that it is institutional. So this isn't just faculty, students, and staff, which of course is very important, I'll talk about it right now just to give you one example that when we do this work, we can't just talk about it. I'm tired of talking about inclusion. I do things about inclusion, and I encourage all of you, when you leave from this conference, lay out 3, 4, 5 things that you will do about inclusion in the areas where you have the ability to influence action and what happens. So we looked specifically at how we recruit for students. We looked at resources that Central University had. And so in this 1 year, so from June, July, when I started through to this year, so we have just wrapped up our recruitment and enrollment process for the next fall. We have increased, at the University of Michigan, we refer to as URMs, underrepresented minorities. We increased our URM applicants at the school by over 30%. And we've increased our actual enrollment by over 20%, the largest in the history of the school. These things are possible. You can make a difference. You can bring about a shift, whether it's in a small entrepreneurial organization or in a large institution that may not have done a host of changes in a number of years. But you do have to gain the data and then implement a plan and implement it without fear. Could have failed. Some things have failed. Luckily, that was successful, and now we have the responsibility of how do we continue that? How do we build on that trajectory? But faculty, students, and staff, not just important in those areas, but it is also important with the curriculum. Getting back to my original slide, what are we teaching our students? And how are we teaching them? Are there teaching methods that students of color respond in different ways to? Is there curriculum that is relevant for students of color that is not being taught? Is there curriculum relevant to our society that we don't teach? Those are the questions that should be asked and answered, and they may not be the same for every institution, but they have to be asked. And so we have launched into this, and I guarantee you it is not a welcome conversation. Right? What faculty members say, oh, you want to just kind of come and talk to me about my curriculum? No way. Right? So we have to engage in what's our goal. If our goal is relevance, then we have to. And we do it in a way where the person who leads it is the faculty member, is the person who's really responsible for that curriculum. But we can provide them tools, we can help them to be able to look to see, are we being inclusive in what and how we are teaching? Another aspect is that we shouldn't be organizationally egotistical. We can't do everything. And there are ways that we can accomplish more than the sum of the parts of partnerships and collaborations that we make. And often, unfortunately, larger institutions can be more insular. And so I restructured the associate deans at the school so that we now have associate deans specifically focused on partnerships and collaborations that the school does. I also reorganized the associate dean structure that relates to inclusion as a whole. So again, if you are in a position where you're looking at a system, you have to make sure that the organizational system can deliver on the outcomes that you want. And if it can't, then you have to change the system itself. You have to change that framework and structure so that people truly can be empowered to do the work that needs to be done within the organization. One of my favorite quotes from famed Nigerian author Chimamanda Adichie, who also has a great TED Talk out there, but she talks about the danger of a single story. So when we think about inclusion, the danger of a single story is not that it is untrue, but that it is incomplete. And the stories that we are weaving in the arts are incomplete. Just the little data that I showed you, and of course you know this anecdotally wherever you go in our field. The stories are incomplete. And if the arts are the way in which we understand each other, understand our cultural differences, our political differences, our racial backgrounds, our geographical backgrounds, if it's the way we communicate and share what is the human condition and human experience with each other, and those stories are incomplete, then there are segments of our society being left out from that conversation. And when that happens, there's only alternative methods to be able to address that alienation. And I think we would all agree, no matter what spectrum of the political or social conversation you are on, the divisiveness, the level of separation that exists in our society has and continues to only grow. And I believe that the arts are one of the core ways that we can address that. Every year, Sphinx celebrates its medals of excellence at the Supreme Court, and Justice Sotomayor has been very supportive. But one of the things that I had the opportunity to see was the deep friendship between Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia before he passed. And you would think, people on just such polar opposites of the political spectrum had a genuine friendship. And that friendship was born out of the arts, specifically a love for the opera, a passionate love for the opera that superseded the political discussions and allowed for a friendship to not only take hold, but really be fostered and nurtured over the years. The power of what we all do is critically important beyond the craft that we teach and that we revere in the art form itself. So getting to excellence, there's actually Justice Sotomayor with Danielle, who you heard play. She's also a recipient of the Sphinx Medal of Excellence. But one of the quotes that I share, and to just kind of lead into the idea of excellence that I share during this event, is from Aristotle. It says, "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit." And this is something I'm always telling our students, as well as our faculty and staff, that we shouldn't look at excellence as let's have an excellent report, let's have an excellent recital, let's do something here. Excellence should be a habit. It should be the nature in which we engage in our daily activities. So when we look at excellence, whether it's in teaching, whether it's in our curriculum, whether it's our performance, our research, or even just our operations, when I'm talking to our staff and we're looking at something, water is a big issue in Michigan, right? So I'm talking with our operations people and I'm talking to them about the water. I'm like, we need to be excellent in how we deal with our water and our air at the school and in our various buildings that we have. No matter what it is, a program for a concert, I look at the program. If there's something wrong, I'm like, why isn't this excellent? The program should be excellent. It's reflecting the concert. Our student or faculty have worked so hard to deliver this incredible, excellent display on stage. The reflection of that in the program should be excellent. It should pervade all of the work that we do. And finally, resources. This goes without saying, but we cannot be relevant if we don't have the resources to be able to do that. Student support, this is the age-old issue in our field, of course. How do we get scholarships, those types of things? It is critically important. But also engaged learning, the opportunity for our students to go and spend time out in the field, learning what it is that they actually want to do on site and not just in the classroom. Bold ideas for public good. This gets to, of course, when you think about our Accelerator Grants, a student can have a dream at the School of Music, Theater, and Dance. Learn how to be able to implement that dream, affect that dream, meet people who are already experts related to that dream, and then gain resources so that they can actually have that bold idea for public good become a reality. We have to be able to, of course, recruit faculty. We need to be able to have the technology and the facilities that will actually facilitate our ability to be the most relevant school of the performing arts. And so before we're getting close to running out of time, and I wanted to just share a bit about the public climate that we all operate in the arts. Just to give you a quick sense, a bunch of these figures you probably already know, but when we look at public support, right, it is a bit tough. Now, before I share all of these, I also want to share too, of course, and this is something that we're actually going through. I'm advising some people in Europe where we have some partnerships, but Europe does not have the history of philanthropy. So we have existing here, of course, amazing private philanthropy in the arts that affects us. But when we look at our public support for the arts, and many people talk about, right, the budgets are moral documents, right? They indicate the priorities of particular governments or institutions. And so when we look at, for example, Germany, we see that it has annual, this goes back to 2009, about $11 billion that it spends on arts and culture. Yes, I'll say that again, $11 billion. Whew, I would love that for Michigan. If we look at the city of Berlin alone, it has a $680 million for the city of Berlin arts and culture budget. And obviously our budget at the NEA is about, it's now about 160 million. And so obviously it is a fraction. But to give you an idea, because it's important to look at GDP and percentage of per capita, so Germany is top. They are high. They are over 2%. So, but most Western nations are about 1% or so. France, Great Britain are about 1%. Unfortunately, obviously, we're nowhere close. We're not 1%. We're not a tenth or a hundredth of a percent. So we are very low in terms of, again, our federal funding for the arts. More importantly is this slide, which I just wanted to make sure that you're able to take a look at and understand when we think about how we grant funding. And now being part of a larger institution, I may not be as thrilled with these numbers. It was great when I was in a smaller budget organization, because this is clearly identifies the disparity of funding for smaller arts organizations. So when we look at total foundation giving in America, it's about $22 billion. For arts and culture grants, it's about $2.3 billion. Now, here's where it gets. Those grants within arts and culture that benefit underserved is about $200 million. And here's where it's most frustrating. For focused arts funders, so this is defined as any foundation where more than 25% of their grants go to arts and culture funding, they are less likely to give to benefit underserved communities. So in other words, in the arts, we have less of a focus. This will become a little bit more clear on this next set of slides when we look at how we distribute our funding within the arts. So there's 100,000 arts organizations in the country. If we take those arts organizations that have a budget of over $5 million, that's about 2%. So that's what we've got there. About 2% of all arts organizations have a budget more than $5 million. Those 2% of organizations receive 55% of all of the arts and culture funding in America. To draw it a little bit more specifically, if we just take the top 50 organizations, which represent 0.0005% of all organizations, just the 50 largest arts institutions receive 50% of all the funding. This data is from NCRP, the National Committee on Responsive Philanthropy, Holly Sidford and others who've done some great work on this. It obviously raised some controversy, of which there are some areas that we can talk about, but the basic data we can't argue with. And what they said is that this pronounced imbalance restricts the expressive life of millions of people, thus constraining our creativity as a nation. The asymmetry disadvantages all of us. Again, thinking about Chimamanda Adichie's, because it restricts the type of cultural expressions we experience. It is the limited voice. It is not that it is inaccurate or that the work being done by the large institutions isn't good. It's that we are not including all of the voices which comprise our society. So last little bit of quotes. Since I sit on the National Council, we're obsessed with the NEA's budget. We're specifically about $146 million. We're going through a process right now. But we're constantly, right, of course, the NEA, as we all hear, is constantly under attack, and the appropriation, and there are those who've wanted to, in recent years, diminish it or even abolish it. So, and that's kind of the nature of the state that we live in. But what I wanted to do is draw an analogy for you just to give you a kind of sense of comparison of government funding as it relates to relevance. So the NEA is all of the arts for the whole country: museums, music, theater, et cetera. So if we look at the military band's budget, not personnel, that's under a different line item. If we just look at the military band's budget, so again, federal funding, it's more than twice the entire NEA. Yet we don't hear the same calls for reducing this appropriation. And there's a reason for that, because there is absolutely no doubt about the relevance of our military bands. They are relevant. They are relevant to our fighting forces. They are relevant to all of our armed forces. They are relevant in the way in which we engage in the security of our nation, and it has been that way for a very long time, going back to the role of music in the Civil War, which we could spend an hour just talking about that. So it is the responsibility of us, our field, to educate and prepare our students to be relevant to their discipline and to make sure that these disciplines we are invested in are relevant to society. And if we can do that, then those types of calls won't be as common. And again, a great quote, a U of M alum, Larry Page, who said recently they created a holding company overall of Google called Alphabet. And he said, we've long believed that companies tend to get comfortable doing the same thing, just making incremental changes. But you need to be a bit uncomfortable to stay relevant. And so I think in the work that we all do, if we're going to do this, I can assure you, over this past year, there's been some uncomfortability at the School of Music, Theater, and Dance at the University of Michigan. But that's good, because that's the only way we can stay relevant. And last quote that I just wanted to share with you, I figured, who better than Martin Luther King? Years ago, I was at a conference in Atlanta, and one of our Sphinx alums had the opportunity to play before Coretta Scott King. And she came up afterwards, there were tears in her eyes, and she was sharing this impact and the role that music had in their lives. You know, they met at NEC, New England Conservatory of Music. The Kings were deeply embedded and invested in music and the role of music in the civil rights movement. And they met at one of our great conservatories. And she talked to me about the impact of music. And it reminds me of this amazing quote of Dr. King, who said, "Change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. History will have to record that the greatest tragedy of this period was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." And so in your institutions, in your daily work in the arts, if you see these aspects of inclusion that need to be addressed, if you see the aspects of the way that young people's lives could be transformed or our society can be transformed, you cannot be silent. You have to be able to fight against the clamor that exists outside. Otherwise, our young people and our society, I believe, will suffer the loss of the role that the arts play in our society, which is profound. Thank you all so much for inviting me to be here with you today.